Turn a city into starry skies.
Oh, and it starts at 6:30.
Honey, I got the flu.
Then let us both in. I'm going to switch yours off. Let's just shut the lid of yours.
It's possible to make waves, but you're stuck waiting on Tuesday fresh cuts. No wonder your head is so low. You got to get music into your soul. And honey, you got the blue. Yeah, yeah. You got to see life through these golden shades. You got to get rid of that blue and see colors and places you haven't before. I know how it goes. The tortured, always the most talented of all. It's the way you hold makes me crumble. And how you get and honey, I get the
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Raymond, and I'm the director of the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg. And really happy this evening to be able to introduce you to Nana Biamah Ofosu, who's joining us from London. Good evening, Nana. Welcome to the GSA. We'd hoped for Nana to be able to physically join us, but with her hectic international schedule, unfortunately, she couldn't join us in person. But we've been talking about ensuring that she comes to visit in person sometime next year. And Nana's going to be speaking to us this evening on a variety of subjects. And I think if you've looked at her profile online or know anything about her, you'll know that she combines being an architect in terms of building projects together with research and with writing. And she's done a number of interesting works architecturally. Recently, one that I saw was the exhibition in Walthamstow, Althea McNeish's work, which was beautiful. I managed to just get to see it on the last day. But she's doing some really very, very interesting things in London. And about she's also working with Leslie Loco, the African Futures Institute, as a researcher. They're doing some very exciting things there. And we're really, really pleased to have her here. As a teacher, Nana teaches at the Kingston School of Art, which is where she was also a student. I think it's worth mentioning that her master's project was nominated for the RIBA Silver Medal, and she won an RIBA Branch Postgraduate Prize, and also was awarded the school's dissertation prize for both her undergraduate and postgraduate dissertations. When she practices in London under the name Studio NYALI with Bushra Mohammed, again doing some really wonderful work. And we're really excited to have her with us this evening. For those of you who are familiar with how we run our talks, we're happy for people to ask questions. Obviously, we don't want to interrupt the presentation. So if you do have questions or you do have anything that comes to mind or any comments, please feel free to post them in the chat. And we have Patricia Bandora, who's one of our students, one of our master students, who's going to be sort of collating the questions. And when Nana has finished, you'll have the chance to ask your questions. And that's something that Patricia is going to be coordinating and directing. So, you know, we often have quite nice, interesting, lively discussions after the talk. It's an opportunity for you to question some of the things or to maybe delve a little bit further and for Nana to expand on things that you're particularly interested in. So Nana, welcome. We're really happy to have you here this evening. And I'm going to hand over to you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm just going to share my screen and get that all set up. I'm going to make that full screen. And can everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
And hear me okay as well?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm thrilled to be joining you all this evening, and looking forward to also being able to join you in person, perhaps sometime very soon. My name is Nana Biamah Ofosu, and I'm an architect, writer, researcher, and teacher. And today I'll be presenting a lecture titled Making, Writing, and Speaking Architecture. This evening, I'm honoured to share with you the story of my practice, which, as I've said, encompasses, it's a multifaceted practice. Thank you very much to Professor Mark Raymond for the generous invitation to join you today at the GSA, and I'm thrilled to be here, as I said. So I'm going to begin the lecture with a bit of an introduction about me and my background, and then go into what I do, and hopefully over the next course of 45 minutes talk a bit about a kind of multifaceted way of practicing that I'm developing and hoping to continue to develop. As I mentioned, my practice is multifaceted. It's based on the premise that architecture is complex, a reading of the human condition. It is centered on the built environment, and recognition that all architecture is based on a story, centered around culture, people, and time. As a practitioner, I co-founded Studio NYALI, an architecture, design, and research-based practice in London with Bushra Mohammed. The work of the practice aims to center peripheral identities, cultures, and people by examining, challenging, and shifting architectural critiques and narratives towards a more inclusive, holistic understanding of the built environment. Our current projects include cultural projects, residential projects, as well as starting to delve into housing projects. I'm also an academic, and I've been teaching at Kingston University since 2017. And I joined the Architecture Association in 2020, firstly teaching with Diploma 6 with Jack Selve and Guillermo Lopez, and in 2021 started teaching Diploma 2 with Bushra Mohammed. I'm a visiting critic to several schools of architecture in the UK and internationally, including at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. My research is one that I initiated with Bushra, my practice partner, as well as research partner, and we are currently undertaking an ongoing research project titled The Course of Empire, a compound house typology. This project is currently funded by the Graham Foundation, and we are completing a publication which will be published next year, about May next year. I also write and I speak and consider these avenues as equally as important as the practice of making buildings as an architect. I was part of the second cohort of New Architecture Writers, a free programme for emerging design writers, developing journalistic skill, editorial contacts, and also developing the critical voice of its participants. Since then, I've gone on to write for different journals here in the UK and also internationally. And for me, I continue to cultivate writing as an architectural practice and continue to use a tool to develop my own position in my practice, as well as telling new stories, which I hope expand the field of architecture and challenge us to dream and imagine radical radical and bold possibilities for the future. I wanted to start this lecture with my own biography, because I strongly believe that it shaped who I am and what I think about architecture and also how I practice. I was born in Ghana and I'm an immigrant to the UK, having moved here when I was 10 years old. To me, these two factors are extremely instrumental in my understanding of architecture. My motivations for studying architecture are captured in this funny childhood anecdote about building mud houses and being upset when they washed away. Yet there's a seriousness to this. For me, it is this inquisitiveness that is precisely the joy of being an architect. It is why, for me, architectural practice is about hybridity, translation, and discovery. In continuing on from the idea of architecture being about one's own biography, this is a quote I came to know in a lecture when I was in my third year, presented by Jamie Faubert, and he started his lecture with this quote from Wittgenstein's diary, written in 1931, and it reads: "Working in philosophy, like architecture, in many respects, is really more a working on oneself, on one's own interpretations, on one's own way of seeing things, and what one expects of them." I think this quote for me has become really much a guiding principle in how I approach architecture. And hearing that as a third year student, it made me realise why I wanted to study architecture in the first place. It reminded me of that inquisitiveness as a child, to explore her surroundings and to find meaning in those surroundings. And I suppose, like Wittgenstein, I'm drawn to this idea that architecture is really a practice of oneself and your own identity and position in our globe, in the world itself, and how you relate to the built environment. I'm going to also continue on this theme of one's own biography by beginning this lecture, beginning the project I will show you with my graduate thesis work. I believe strongly that a graduate thesis project is one of the most important projects for an architect. In conversation recently with Francis Kere, he said this: I tell students to think about their graduating project simultaneously as their last academic project and their first real project. So the thesis project is really a defining one for many architects, and I'm no different, in the sense that many of the questions I am still investigating can be found here in these two projects I'll present. Questions about the relationship between housing, urbanism, and landscape thread these two projects. This first one, Forming a Whole from Ruins, investigated the legacy of Alvaro Siza's seminal Malagueira housing project. The architectural theorist Sebastian Miró describes architecture as the following: architecture as an instrument is an instrument of memory. Memory is a material dimension, or an architectural dimension. Rather than taking architecture as a starting point, this project explored landscape and the pastoral qualities of a place as a way of creating new spaces and new commons. It is a project about traces, memory, and myth. This project was also exhibited as part of the Forum Malagueira exhibition held in Portugal by Drawing Matter, and coincided with the 40th anniversary of Malagueira's completion. And it was a real joy to kind of be able to use a project, a graduate project, to explore the legacy of a place and retell the stories of a place, and also build onto it what its new future possibilities could be. Taking the lessons I learned from Malagueira, my fifth year project turned its focus to London. The project sought to examine London's edge condition, looking at how much of the city has been shaped, or could be even argued constrained, by the metropolitan greenbelt. Applying Miró's concepts of memory and architecture, as well as the nuanced relationship between architecture and landscape that I discovered in Siza's Malagueira, I developed a housing project which saw itself as a catalyst, a way to change the relationship between the city and its edge condition. Again, this project was about the traces and histories that are so important to the underpinnings of a city. It's been a while since I presented my graduate thesis work. Often there's a view that as one progresses in their career, these things become secondary. However, for me, these projects have been the basis of my practice today. But equally, it's also important to critique what was missing, unexplored or unquestioned. My identity and its relationship to architecture and the built environment were not necessarily questions asked within my education. It left me wondering. And when I was asked to write about my architectural inspirations for the Architect's Journal in 2020, I included Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun as one of my inspirations. For me, this book is seminal. I firstly read it as a 21-year-old, and it was a revelation as well as a revolution. There was so much of my own West African history that I discovered through reading this book. It led me to want to uncover more. It also left me wanting to question what else was missing. Architecture to me is about history, memory, and legacy. But if only one story is told, then how can architecture truly be a record of all humanity? Also, in this Half of a Yellow Sun, I found a rich, vivid descriptions of landscapes, architectures of independence, and communal practices of living, which for me felt both familiar and forgotten. Adichie was telling stories that spoke to my own lived experience of space that unfortunately was left unexplored in my Western architectural education. I've also included here Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. For me, Bell Hooks is another really fundamental writer. In Teaching to Transgress, I began to understand and unpick the role of architectural education in centering peripheral identities, cultures, and people. Hooks writes, all of us in the academy and in the culture as a whole are called to renew our minds if we are to transform educational institutions and society, so that in that way we live, and so that the way that we live, teach, and work can reflect our joy in cultural diversity, our passion for justice, and our love for freedom. For me, not only did I liken this to architectural education, but also architectural practice. The built environment is our collective legacy, and so should speak for all of us. It must hold the memory, myths, inspirations, and aspirations of all of us. It must represent a cultural diversity of the world that we inhabit. The rest of this lecture is structured into 3 parts. I will speak firstly about my practice, making architecture. I co-founded Studio NYALI in 2021 with Bushra Mohammed. We met during our graduate studies at Kingston School of Art and have worked collaboratively in the past, previously namely on our joint research project on African compound housing. Bushra and I share a similar biography, having emigrated to the UK at a young age and finding that as first-generation African immigrants, partly raised and educated as architects in the UK, we had not seen our experiential understanding of space reflected in our academic or professional experience. As I mentioned before, our work aims to centre peripheral identities, cultures, and people, as well as examining, challenging, and shifting architectural narratives towards a more holistic understanding of a more inclusive built environment. And tonight I'll present 3 projects. I'll present firstly the Archi Africa Pavilion, our work for the Althea McNeish Colour is Mine, and also a project called A House for a God. So this, the Architecture Pavilion, the Archi Africa Pavilion was one which we designed and built as part of the European Cultural Centre's participation in the 17th International Architecture Biennale in Venice. We work collaboratively with Archi Africa and One-to-One Collective, a practice we also count as friends, who are also based in London, as well as being alumni of Kingston School of Art, as well as our students from Kingston School of Art. Our relationship with Archi Africa began in 2019 when we visited Ghana with our design studio from Kingston School of Art. The project was developed was developed as an architectural response to these thematic ideas and elements. And firstly, I'll talk about compounds. As I'll touch on a bit later, our research has been looking at the African compound house. And for us, the pavilion was a chance to physically manifest some of these things that we were interested in. And so firstly, the plan, which I'll show later and talk about in more detail, is based on the African compound, the kind of communal space found at the heart of housing in traditional African architecture. It manifests differently across the continent, but it's something that we believe can be found all across the continent in very different forms and used differently in ways that suits the people and their ritual and practices, as well as the climatic needs of the region. We also took the project as an opportunity to explore the language of totems and markers and signifiers. And for us, these totems are a bit like identity signifiers. They become representative of the people that the projects are built for. And in here, we're looking at some Igbo traditional architecture from southeastern Nigeria. And these very beautiful carvings into the entranceways sort of signify meaning for the household that lives behind that threshold. And these large communal totems are also signifiers of a collective identity. Stools have always been an important symbol in Asante origin and mythical beliefs. The Asante people believe that they descend from, the stool is a holy object descending from earth, representing the soul of the Asante nation. It is also, as well as symbolizing a big part of their culture, it's also about the communality and the aspects of sitting together, learning together, and that kind of commune and coming together. So in the pavilion, we try to encourage and use these kinds of elements to form seating and places to kind of congregate and share stories and narratives. Fabric was also a very important element in the pavilion, as I'll show later. And for us, fabric was also another way of storytelling. The fabrics such that I'm showing here on the right is a Ewe Kente fabric from Ghana. And much like these fabrics are very much used to tell stories and used to record events, and also the idea of the weave. And so for us, the loom also became a very important aspect of this, that the loom is a double-sided thing. It's a place for conversation, and also the act of making and weaving stories and narratives was something that we wanted to encompass in our pavilion. And then lastly, building. For us, this project was undertaken as a self-build project with our collaborators, One-to-One Collective, who were amazing partners in getting this pavilion made. But we also took the pavilion as a way of forming community with our students and inviting them to collaborate with us to build the pavilion. And for us, the pavilion was also a learning opportunity. It was a learning opportunity for us to see architectural drawings become realized as architectural form, but it was also an opportunity to practice this act of communal building. And the Nigerian Igbo people have a culture, historically had a culture called Mabri, which was was an art practice, but it was also a building practice, where the young men would help build each other's homes. And this idea that we build community through the way that we make architecture is a really central part of our practice. And I'll just explore some of the drawings we made and the ideas behind this, and how these ideas that I've just talked to are manifested in the design of the pavilion. The pavilion is a 5x5 pavilion. Which aims to celebrate African and Black diaspora voices in response to the Biennale's questioning theme that year of how we live together. So in these drawings, you can see the manifestation of our interest in fabric providing shelter, being woven to provide a kind of roof for the pavilion, and then also this language of the totems in front at the front of the pavilion, these two large blocks as signifiers for the pavilion. They're kind of marking a threshold. And then also thinking about seating. So we involve seating as a dual thing in the pavilion, externally and internally, so that the nature of the pavilion is transformed through the way the people occupy it. And you can see here we were also thinking about the structural logic and the building of this pavilion. So using timber, and when the pavilion was demounted, the timber went to an organization in Venice who are reusing that pavilion. So it's also about ways of thinking about how we build, what we build, and the legacy of how the things that we make affect the environment. The pavilion was situated in Marumanessa Gardens, a public park off the Laguna, adjacent to a set of residential buildings, and it acted as a social ecosystem for the neighborhood in the time that it existed. It also acted as a gathering place, a point of reference for all who were visiting the Biennale, and also as a place to exchange and discuss how we would live together in the future. Through a series of programs and exhibitions and talks that we curated, we discussed how the UK can, and Europe as a whole could learn from Indigenous ways of living on the African continent. I'll now move on to talking about Althea McNeish, Colour is Mine. At the beginning of the year, we were appointed to be as the 3D designers for Althea McNeish, the Colour is Mine exhibition. Which was a landmark exhibition, a landmark retrospective exhibition on Althea McNeish at the William Morris Gallery here in London. Althea was one of the UK's most innovative textile designers and the first designer of Caribbean descent to achieve international recognition. Yet until this year, there had hardly been she'd been confined to a secondary figure in British design. The exhibition aimed to reveal her legacy and undeniable impact on British design. To talk about Althea McNeish, for us, we believe that she holds her rightful place as a major influence in British textile design. And it was really interesting to be invited to put on to design this exhibition at the William Morris Gallery. William Morris himself, having been an artist and a textile designer, much influenced by other places in the world. And Althea's own history and personal narrative really translates into her work. Everything I did, I saw through a tropical eye. This is a quote taken from McNeish herself, and it explores the relationship between her identity, biography, and how she worked. The ideas evident in her work very much taken from her childhood memory of Trinidad, as well as the discovery of the English landscapes. And Althea talked at length about the combinations of these two places that she was familiar with and the influences of those places on her work. And so in designing the exhibition, we worked through a series of spaces within the gallery. And here you can see these fabric overhangs that we use in the cafe space of the gallery. And what we were really trying to do here, much like the pavilion, was use fabric as a way of making enclosure and an architectural experience. It was also a real joy to be working in the cafe, which looked out onto this kind of rich landscape. And given that much of Althea McNeish's work was influenced by the kind of rich landscape she discovered in Trinidad and also in the UK, it was a very nice moment to be able to connect her fabrics and the way that they make and hold space to the external views of the William Morris Gallery. And so in the first room in this special gallery, we were really influenced by Althea's own practice, her use of colour, her use of fabrics, and we were quite clear from the beginning that we wanted to make an exhibition that really used colour in a really bold and definitive way, as well as incorporated fabrics into the design. And so using the fabrics, the colour as a way of creating an experience through the room, we tried to use the fabrics that we chose as kind of backdrops to really accentuate Althea McNeish's work. And the work was so powerful and so rich that it was just really a joy to make a space that could hold those works. There was also the Discovery Lounge, which showed a film and some of her sort of painterly works as well, which influenced and were the templates for her design work. And in this film, what's particularly beautiful is hearing Althea talk about her own reflections and her own position within British textile design. And for me, she was a seminal figure in the way that, in the use of colour and materiality in British textiles design today. We were also very lucky to collaborate with Mark El-Khatib, who was the graphic designer. And as part of this kind of journey through the sequence of spaces in the gallery, we wanted to show you different experiences of Althea at work in her studio as you walked and experienced the gallery. More upstairs in the gallery, where we were really trying to celebrate her work on Carnival and the ritual of Carnival and the colours and patterns of Carnival. And so for us, again, it was really important to use colour as a way of telling the story. As part of the exhibition, we also designed an installation called based on Althea McNeish's Bachelor Girls Room. And for us, it was a really amazing opportunity to contribute something spatial to the exhibition. And I'll talk a bit through this project now. So in 1966, Althea McNeish designed the Bachelor Girls Room as part of the Ideal Homes exhibition. McNeish imagined this room as a room for a bachelor girl who was about 26 years old, not too flush with cash, but with a mind of her own. Her room, costing about £325 and calculated for today's money, £5,440, was designed to be flexible and adaptable, in its use. And here you can see some photographs of Althea McNeish in the spaces she designed. The furniture she designed was a mix of things specifically designed for the room, as well as more everyday utilitarian objects. And her use of colour and her own fabrics and furnishing the room was something that it's a real joy to behold in the room that she designed. So for us, this was such great inspiration again to work from. And we wanted to ask the questions about who is the bachelor girl of today. So if this is who she was in 1966, who is the bachelor girl of today? And I'll start by talking about some of our inspirations for that, for the project. So we're really interested in the idea of a room of one's own. And that comes from the writings of Virginia Woolf, but it's also in the kind of architectural aspirations that really interested us. And when you look at these two images, you might ask, what does St. Jerome in his study and a not compound dwelling have to do with one another? But for us, they're both, for us in this project, there were both references that were about making spaces within a space in which one can find their own self. For St. Jerome, it's a place of study and quiet and contemplation. And for the Knock people and their individual dwellings, it's really a space of their own. So while they're in community, there's also an appreciation of a space that is truly for oneself. And the kind of, for us in this drawing of the Knot compound, what really Knot compound house, and what really comes across is that even in the kind of enclosed, quite tight space, there is a joy found in making spaces within the space. Colour was also really important to us. I think you can't look at McNeish's work and not be inspired by her use of colour. So for us, we wanted to take colour as a spatial element, to treat it as a way of defining the spaces within the room. And then also really important for us was to ask the question of, well, who is the bachelor girl of today? And for us, the bachelor girl of today is somebody connected with multiple locations and identity. And as I've said before, both Bushra and I's own biography was important to think through while designing this. So for us, the Bachelor Girls Room was also really an opportunity to explore questions about identity and the diaspora in the British context. And so for us, literature also played a very big role in trying to define what that space was like and what inspired that space. And so here are some images of the Bachelor Girls Room. As I've mentioned before, the bachelor girl is a person of multiple locations and locales. And for her, the room is a way of expressing who she is. And so for us, it was really important that as well as the installation being about our personal narratives, it was an invitation for others to consider what dwelling means today and what our rituals and habits are and how those are manifested spatially. So here we're looking at the private space of the within the bachelor girls' room, where she would have a bed and a place to be by herself and secluded when she chose to be. And then here we're looking, as you enter the room, there's a kind of more public zone of the bachelor girls' room. And you can see for us the objects and furnishings of the room were equally as important as the space that we'd made. So we selected a series of books that for us really spoke to the idea of the identity of the bachelor girls, clothing that also spoke to this, and also furnishings and the use of colour that really spoke to the idea of somebody who's connected to the UK, but also to other places, as well as being inspired by McNeish's use of colour. I'll now move on to talking about a project called A House for a God. In 2021, we were invited to participate in Efie, the Museum is Home, an exhibition curated by Nana Friata-Echim and held in the Museum Ostwald in Dortmund. For us, this idea of a fear was really a pertinent thing, and to respond to the exhibition, we decided to make a proposal that talked about the house as a communal aspect, but also belonging to everyone, and being a symbol of public and community. The house, the word Efie is the Akan word, the Akan tree word for house. And the symbol on the left is a Fienkra symbol. The Akan people of South Central Ghana have a symbol and pattern language based, a symbol and pattern based language called the Adinkra. Fienkra is a symbol of security and safety. Translated, it also means house and compound. I will talk about the shape of the communal. It also takes the form of the communal compound house also takes its form from this symbol. And for us, it was a really interesting place to begin our explorations about the idea of a house for a God. For the Asante people, the idea of a house being about your own self and your own family, but also returning to the community was a really foundational part of the Ashanti Kingdom. And here you can see an image, an etching from the Gold Coast, the Ashanti Kingdom in the Gold Coast in 1890. And you can see here the kind of formation of the built environment is really shaped by the kind of idea of these compounds and clusters and how people live together communally. And so here are some other drawings made by Thomas Edward Budwich on his travels to the Asante Kingdom in 1817. But it's also really important to think about the new meanings and the new celebrations of identity and not rely solely on the colonial lens. So the works of people like Godfrey Donkor in his paintings, one of his paintings called The First Day of the Yam Festival Custom, in which it shows a celebration and the celebration of the Yam Festival, which is marking a new season in the Ashanti calendar, was really significant because for us, the house, while being about the individual, is also about the collective identity, and it's about the spirit of the people who inhabit it. And for the Asantes, that's a really important thing. So the Ejuso Besiansa Shrine House, which you can see here on the right, was a really crucial inspiration for this project for us. And the Ejuso Besiansa Shrine House was a shrine house that was made quite literally as a home for a god. It's the home for the Asante god, and the Asantes believe that your spirit is an important element of who you are, and it also manifests physically with you, and that's why they build houses for gods. And so our work really was based on this idea of the shrine house and exploring the shrine, this idea of the kind of form of the shrine house. It's a building, as I've described, as a house for a deity. And it's really a reflection of traditional Asante architecture. It is a house. It's a house for a god built by by us, the people, and also seeking our own godliness through a physical form. In continuing to pursue our interest in the compound house typology, our installation had 3 parts to it, which we hope reflected the meaning of building. Our work was interested in questioning the relationship between the house and the museum. In a culture where tradition is kept alive through performance, oral practices, and ancestral kinship, the museum can be described as a place for dead things, but actually, if we think about it, the home is really an embodiment of the spirit. And so our installation as part of this group show included 3 parts. It included three tiles that we made that I'll talk about later, an artifact that was a kind of memory based on the Giusto Bessignazza Shrine House, and a soundscape that kind of held these objects together in these vuvuzelas that were designed by along with Dike Osaro and the curator of the show. And so what we wanted was a really immersive experience bound together by these physical objects that we'd made. And so the connection of the physical objects and the kind of ephemeral quality of the soundscape that went along with it, that was really meant and designed as an experiential thing as you kind of walked around this vuvuzela, which acts as a kind of ephemeral and transient lightweight structure against these kind of heavy clay-based things. And the soundscape was all about trying to really make reflections on this idea of the house for a god, and the idea that from the clay that we come is the thing that we make houses from, our homes from. So essentially we are connected through the act of building to the ground and to a kind of richer history and narrative of our ancestors. So our work really explored, as I've mentioned, really explored the idea that that the same fabric, the muddy tissues of the ancestors' bodies are really the thing that also we use to make the spaces in which we dwell. The clay tiles that we made, three glazed clay tiles, really trying to be reminiscent of the terracotta coloring of Ghanaian laterite soil. These tiles were made in the kind of human form, using carvings and working into clay, the image of people, ourselves, as ways of reflecting this idea that carving from clay is how we make places and spaces. And as part of the work that we made the soundscape, and the soundscape was really a long form prose storytelling narrative that was retold by several voices, both in Tree, which is the local Akan language, one of the dialects, one of the many languages in Ghana, as well as in English. And the idea of overlaying these voices, reading these narratives, was to get this ephemeral quality going, and this idea of memory and translation through the built environment. And so I've just selected 2 parts from that long form poem, and I'll just read them. So this is the first stand of the poem, which was entitled Nananyami Fie, and Nananyami is is God in the Akan language, and Fie is house, so essentially the house of a god. Nananyami the divine, we are human and therefore all children of Nananyami. The divine pronouncement among the Akan that all humans are children of God, Nananyami the divine. We all descend directly from God through Nyami's chosen deities and divinities. Human beings are the very essence of Nyami. And I'll conclude by reading the last stanza of this long form poem, which concludes by celebrating the presence of the house for a god and its uses within the kind of Asante mythology. On the 40th day, on a Wednesday or Sunday, the drums will beat, there will be offerings, there will be blessings. Nananyami's home will come alive. Museums are places for dead things, but home is the embodiment of our spirit. Home is a place for Nananyami, the divine. And so that concludes this part, the first part of the presentation, in talking about the practice of making architecture, I'll now talk a bit about the practice of writing. And I start with this quote from Donna Haraway in her work Staying with the Trouble. She says, it matters what matters we used to think about other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. And for me, this is a really important part of why I take my architectural writing as a form of practice, because it's really important that stories we tell are representative of all of us. And for me, this is a really crucial part of my architectural practice. I include here an image of some of the things I've contributed to. So I continuously write for journals based in the UK and also globally, as well as contributions to books. Most recently, a monograph on the work of William Scott, a San Francisco-based artist whose work really, for me, is a bold manifestation of architecture. And William Scott himself describes himself as an architect, although he's an artist. And I find that really interesting. I was fortunate to be interviewed by Archive, which is a kind of interview platform looking at architects and the collection of books. And for me, this interview was really a moment to think about my own writing practice and how much of that is actually my own fervent love of reading. And when coming to doing this interview, which took place in my home, it was really interesting to kind of look at my own bookshelf and collection and really realize that there are equal amounts of architecture books as they are of fictional books. And for me, architecture exists within the realms of fiction. Until a building is built, it is a manifestation of our ideas only on paper. And in some ways, that for me, I've never been able to shake off the relationship between literature and architecture. I'm just going to talk through some of the things I've contributed to, which for me have been really important in my my practice as a writer. In 2021, as part of a concluding project for new architecture writers, we were invited to contribute to Frame magazine. And I wrote an article called No Facade, The Joy of Blurred Boundaries. And it was really an ode to my parents and their story as immigrants to the UK and settling in Peckham firstly when they arrived in the UK, and how Peckham has been home to people from Africa, especially the West African community, settling in Peckham as a kind of first port of call almost in arriving to the UK. And for me, I've always loved Peckham, although it's something that I discovered when I moved to London. I didn't grow up in London. Moving to London and discovering a place like Peckham made me really understand this idea of kind of translating a place and kind of defining things that are familiar to people and translating those ideas into different places. And actually that there is a joy in this translation, and that this translation needs to be part of our architectural practice in terms of making spaces that reflect the people that we are designing for. And in this piece, I was really trying to explore the idea of use and misuse, and how the simple English terrace lends itself to a kind of misuse. And you see that in the kind of choreography of street life in Peckham, the kind of African shops, the kind of bustle and burst onto the sidewalks, the fact that the simple English terrace allows for such transformation to accommodate these things was something I found spectacular and really rich in observing. For me, I consider this just really the beginnings of a deeper exploration into the idea of kind of translating different places and cultures into the UK as a way of really trying to understand the manifestations and contributions of Europe's diaspora on our built environment. As part of my writing, I've been profoundly lucky to be able to talk to some amazing architectural practitioners, such as Francis Kere, who I interviewed as part of Kinfolk for Kinfolk magazine in 2021. And for me, this was a very rich conversation, which for me really charted many of the things that I'm interested in. The idea of architecture as craft, as tradition, as a thing that really can encompass our memories and myths of architecture. And it was a really interesting conversation to be able to delve into his own practice and the things and associations that I found in my own work. I've also interviewed Sir David Adjaye, and in that conversation, it was really about talking about the vision of Africa and what Africa can hold for our global future. And we talked at length about the relationship the relationship between architecture and really the planet. And he described architecture as a planetary practice rather than the global one. And it was really about understanding the systems and the essence of our human habitation of a place. And so yeah, these are just some a page from that Hadara publication. And I'll talk a bit similarly as research is really for me researching also comes under this idea of writing. And so, as I mentioned before, Bushra and I initiated a project called the African Compound House, and we've been researching this topic since 2019. And it's been the basis of our teaching practice, as well as the fact that we continue to research this and are making a publication towards this, on this subject. So what is the compound house? The compound house is a multi-generational dwelling with a central open space and a veranda for communal activities and access. The attributes of the compound house is that it creates a layered range of public and semi-public, semi-private and private spaces. This exposure to both public and private life fosters a sense of civic engagement. And so far, our work and our research is focused on Ghana, and we hope to expand that research to look at other regions in the African continent. As I mentioned earlier, compound housing can be found across the African continent, and it responds to its region in terms of the people, the cultures, as well as the climatic needs of the people in that area. And I guess this research project was really started because for us, for me certainly, when people would always ask and try to kind of find ways of describing African architecture, always felt very insufficient. It was always based on very superficial things such as color or shape, or as a Ghanaian, the kente cloth and pattern. And all those things are true about African architecture. They're elements of it, but they're not the whole. And it's hard to describe the architecture of such numerous and extensive tribes and people, as well as 54 countries, within a kind of singular narrative. We don't apply that lens to a European architecture. So I've always questioned, why do we? Why is it that people have always tried to force that onto the African continent and its architecture? But the one thing that is enduring in African architecture is this idea of of communality, the communes, and the idea of publicness, and the idea of the house as really an element that is belonging to the person, but also to the to everyone. The house is really a small part of the city. And as in Aldo van Eyck's writings, the idea of the house being a small city and a city being like a house is really important in our kind of thinking about our research. So through our work so far, we've discovered that the compound house really has five main attributes. Firstly, the compound, and the compound is really it's really a place of gathering communality. Because the house is really an institution and not just a structure, its purpose is a complex. It's a way of, the house is a cultural phenomenon. It's a way of organizing ourselves and giving form to the way that we live. And in the African compound house, a courtyard is really the central manifestation of these ideas. The unroofed open courtyard provides a setting, or rather a subsystem of settings within which specific activities can occur as part of a larger organization of activities. The courtyard or the compound acts as the hearth of the house. It is a place where intergenerational relationships and collective social values are developed and nurtured. Apologies. Oh, gosh. It also provides an important setting for the different communal activities such as weddings, family rites and rituals, and also the celebration of such as weddings and funerals often take place in these spaces. It feels civic in its presence, and it's really a kind of microcosm of a public square set within a private domain. The second important attribute of the compound house is its privacy mechanism. It's a way of protecting the inhabitants, but also making connections to the wider public space and the kind of formation, the urban formation of a place. The third important part of the compound house is really the veranda. Between the relatively private bedroom and the semi-public courtyard is a semi-private covered veranda. Mostly it is used for kind of routine. It's a thoroughfare, but it's also used for routine household activities such as cooking, washing, and cleaning. In the contemporary compound house, as you can see on the left, typically found in kind of urban centres, this space has become built into and encroached upon as people search for more spaces. But you can see then that in the more traditional manifestations of it, such as the GSA, it was really another manifestation of space. It was really an outdoor room and a territory before you enter the kind of private space. The fourth important element about the compound house that we've discovered is that it's really a way of embodying collective identity. Historically, family compounds were linked to pedestrian routes, which were connected to important communal centres such as markets, religious buildings, and settlement gates. The walls of the compound were generally decorated or signposted, forming really important thresholds and main facades. Symbols and decorations were usually part of this language, and you can really see how much the compound house contributed to the kind of urban form and urbanism of a place. We've lost that in the kind of urban cities that we find on the African continent, and our work is not just about historicizing these things, but it's about asking the question about how we can translate these manifestations that for so long served us so well into the kind of urban places that we live now, and how can we manifest some idea of communality in these urban forms. And then really one of the key things about the compound house, and I think why it's so relevant in today's in the kind of development of contemporary African cities, is its efficiency. Unlike the kind of private villa, which needed to be completed thoroughly before being able to be inhabited, the compound house could be made through stages. People could, as their family grew or as their wealth accrued, they could add to this structure. And so it was a really efficient way of building. It also embeds ideas about time and the passage of time in architecture. And for us, these are really important things to explore, and what that can mean for today's practice of developing contemporary African cities. We're continuing this work. We undertook another research trip back to Ghana over the summer to complete our research, and we completed an epic journey from Accra, which is on the coast of Ghana, all the way up to the northern part of Ghana, which borders Burkina Faso. So we traveled the length of the country recording different compound houses and their situations, and this work will be shared in our upcoming publication. But I just thought I'd share a few of the images that we gathered so far. And this is another shrine house. This is a brim shrine house, also in Kumasi in the Ashanti region. And again, you can see the use of this kind of veranda space as this place for gathering. This is us talking to the Queen Mother and guardian of the shrine house, as well as other important people in the community. We were also very lucky to be able to document our research topic really widely with kind of drone footage, looking at, and you can really understand the way the places are shaped by these kind of compounds. And this is a picture, an image taken in Amamama in the in Cape Coast, which is in the southern part of Ghana. And you can really see how the compound house has evolved. It's using new kind of contemporary materials such as tin roofing and kind of block work. And so it's not necessarily about fetishizing an idea of kind of earth building, but translating these things into new forms and new typologies that are suitable for how we live now. But also, in the same way, understanding that there is so much value in the way that we used to build. And here we're looking at some compound housing in Seguru, and you can see the kind of the mix of forms where they have adapted some of their buildings, and some of them are still historic kind of earth buildings. And so it's really about this language of translation that we hope to embody in our research. And lastly, I'll speak a bit about speaking architecture. And for me, the idea of speaking architecture is really important, and it feels for a long time, it's felt at odds with the kind of practice of architecture. If architecture is physical, then what does speaking it, what does pronouncing it have to do with making architecture? But for me, it's really important that we see architecture as a way of communicating what it is we believe fundamentally as people. Our architecture is a record of who we are. And to engender that record, we need to talk about architecture. We need to speak with confidence about what it is we believe. I especially believe that it's really important for our practice, the future survival of the practice of architecture, really, that we learn to sit comfortably with the idea of ourselves as translators, people who can speak across the different parts of the practice of and kind of construction and built environment professionals. We are really one of the last people and professionals who work across different specialisms. And a bit like, you know, the saying jack of all trades, usually that's used in a quite derisive way, but actually the second part of that saying is that you know, while you might be a jack of all trade and a masters of none, it is still better to know something about everything and to be able to speak confidently about it. And I really do believe that in some ways the practice of architecture is a bit like being a jack of all trades. It is about hybridity. It is really about these three prongs. It is about making, it's about writing, it's about speaking architecture. And I've been very lucky throughout my career to find opportunities to do so. As I mentioned before, I was part of the second cohort of new architecture writers. And as part of our first project, we put on this an event called Drawing the Edge of the Centre. And it was really a way of inviting built environment professionals into dialogue with us about the kind of this idea of the edge and the center of architecture. And we wanted to talk about these ideas in a really broad spectrum, relating to physical place, but also relating to the identity of people and diaspora, and thinking about what it means to be in the center, what it means to be at the edge, what happens when we don't think about these two places as binaries, but actually places that need one another to be in conversations, to develop a more holistic understanding of who we are and the places that we make. Our second project as part of New Architecture Writers was a takeover of the Architecture Foundation, which is based in London here. And this was during lockdown, so this was all facilitated online. And it was really a month-long festival of kind of curated talks and panel discussions that we as a group curated together. And in these discussions, we were interested in looking at, we called it Depends on Your Perspective. And it was really a way of asking, well, what do we as 5 writers of colour, as 5 Black writers, have to contribute to architectural criticism today? And so we explore topics about, the history of architectural education, the history of architectural journalism. We had an event called Power versus Palladio, which was a really important forum where we wanted to speak to the way that writers of colour really can bring new narrative to architecture, and that for so long architectural critique has been in the kind of purview of really, in the UK certainly, of white men, and that has made a kind of culture of a very singular narrative, and that our job as contemporary young writers who have different lived experiences was to contribute to that and changing that perspective of what architecture means today. As was mentioned earlier, I'm also a researcher at the African Futures Institute, and it's a pleasure to be part of the African Futures Institute as a researcher, because I think it's a place that is really providing a home, a place, and a movement towards kind of new, imagining new African futures. And last month, I was myself and Isaac Nana Benin were invited to take part and represent the Institute at the V&A's Friday Late series that they had curated with Guap, which was titled "We Face Forward." And Issy and I used this opportunity to talk about the work of the Africa's Futures Institute and centre around 2 themes about geography and generosity. And this idea for us was really about about Africa and the diaspora and its diaspora, and this connection, this global connection that we share, and these ideas that in thinking about generosity and thinking about people like Paul Gilroy, who've written about the Black Atlantic, how these ideas about place and territory can connect us and help us also think about a new future for Africa and Africa's architecture, as well as its the continent's global position and what it means to look towards a future where Africa is really the centre. And lastly, on the topic of speaking architecture, is really teaching architecture. And for me, teaching is a way to speak to architecture. It's to enable and really be in dialogue with the next generation of practitioners. I feel absolutely privileged to be able to teach, and I find the students who I've taught, I find them to be exceptional people, but also really true collaborators. For me, the joy of teaching is that every day I'm in dialogue with new ideas and new translations of things that I might consider everyday or mundane, but actually in the speaking and the teaching and the dialogue that is involved in architectural education, one discovers new ideas and has the opportunity to build on new ideas. And so this is projects from a selection of projects from a studio that I taught in 2019 to 2020, which was directly related to our research on the African Compound House, and the studio was titled The Course of Empire, the African Compound House. And this was these were projects developed by second-year students, and it was taught by myself, Michael Badu, Mary Von Johnson, and Bushra Mohammed. I've continued to develop that practice of kind of looking at the African Compound House as a place to really start as a proposition for developing new architectural typologies. And this was a studio that Bushra and I ran this year, this academic year just passed at Kingston. This was the work of Chelsea Richards, a third-year student who was actually also nominated for the RIBA Bronze Medal. In this year, we worked looking at, the studio was titled Home Nation, and it was looking at the idea of the legacy of tropical modernism in West Africa. and we based our studio in the University of Ibadan, looking at James Ruhr Maxwell Fry's architecture and really critiquing the legacy of tropical modernism. What is there to be celebrated? Whose history is significant here? What does it actually mean for the people that live there? And how do we sort of reflect on this legacy, this really quite a colonial and sometimes violent legacy of architecture? What do we do with these buildings? And so in projects such as Chelsea's, she was thinking about these buildings really inspired by traditional Nigerian architecture and the compounds and courtyards that form the kind of the affins, which are an affin is a palace in Yoruba culture. And so Chelsea's project was really trying to repair and mend and make new kinds of spaces out of Drew and Fry's buildings by adding to them, making incisions, cutting into them, but then also adding new forms that were these kind of compound forms that were kind of low-lying buildings, really based on the traditional Yoruba architecture that she'd studied. As I mentioned, I also teach at the Architecture Association, and this work here is the work of Jose Lau, called Our Future Memory. And the AA, our studio is really invested in looking at the diaspora and its and how the diaspora of the UK and also largely of Europe has really contributed and shaped the kind of built environment that we have today. Typically, the contribution of the diaspora are kind of reduced to colour and kind of very ephemeral representations in the built environment. But we believe that the effects of the diaspora are much more integral and much more situated in the built environment. And it's our work with our students here was really to look for those things, and also to develop ways in which the diaspora can actually feel in charge of the spaces that they live in, that they dwell in. And so we were looking particularly at kind of alternative models of dwelling. And Jose's really accomplished project was looking at the legacy of colonialism in his home country in Hong Kong, and looking at questioning what would have been the legacy of Hong Kong's form had colonialism not been an event. But he also acknowledges the fact that colonialism was something that happened. And so he based this project in a kind of memory and used narrative and kind of storytelling as a way of imagining a new future. And these really beautiful collages and drawings that he made are representations of that work. And so I conclude now with by summarising what you've patiently listened to, which has been about my kind of practice, which is centred around making, writing, and speaking. And for me, it's really about the kind of act of architecture as translation. Architecture is a translation of our own beliefs, our memories, our myths, and our rituals, and our kind of daily practice of life, manifested and built in physical form. And for me, as a practitioner who's interested in a kind of hybrid practice of architecture, it's really important that my practice is centered around these three ways of practicing. And I hope to continue to develop that. It's an unfinished project. I'm very much at the beginning of my career, and I hope to continue to develop that as time goes on. So I'll leave it there, and I say thank you very much for listening. Thank you. I'm just going to stop sharing and return back, and hopefully there's time for a bit of a conversation.
Yes, I think there's still time. Thank you, Nana, so much for your presentation. It was very inspiring and thought-provoking. I think I found a lot of parallels, and I could relate to some of the things as a young African Black woman studying architecture, also navigating, the world, living in a different country that's not of my own. So yeah, thank you so much. So good evening, everyone. As Professor Mark Raymond introduced me, my name is Patricia Bandora, and I am a master's student at the GSA. We now have moved on to the Q&A session part of the talk, and I will begin by asking you, Nana, 2 questions from the GSA students, Chineye and Simpiwe. In the meantime, I will ask the public to write your questions in the chat, or if you want, you could raise your hand and I'll get to them right after. But unfortunately, Chineye and Simpiwe are experiencing load shedding. We have load shedding in South Africa, so I will have to ask their questions for them.
Jumsaw in Ghana, so no.
Yeah, so Chineye asks, the practice is focused on identity, shared histories, and spaces with a strong belief that architecture must be understood as the embodiment and artifact of the human experience. The studio's dedication to including other narratives and non-traditional perspectives to better serve a pluralist society all add to the archive of architectural and spatial knowledge. Is the aim to see transformation and more diversity in design solution in the near future? Have some of the solutions arising from this come to fruition?
Yeah, I would definitely say that is our absolute aim. It's about seeing some of these translations becoming manifested in our built environment. In a city like London, which has a very high population of non-white inhabitants, it is still a city that is very much shaped on kind of the idea of kind of traditional Englishness. And you have to ask the question about, is the city really representative of those that live here? And is the city really a place and a home for its kind of culturally diverse inhabitants? And so for us, it's really about asking the question about how we take these ideas and people's own lived experience and spatial experiences and translate them into the built environment. I think in terms of has that started to translate? I hope that in the projects I presented this evening that you can see some of that kind of translation and manifestation of it. At the moment, it's been in things like our pavilion, but also in being able to work on the Althea McNeice show and really things like that, the Bachelor Girls Room, which are really for us ways of testing these ideas in preparation for bigger and larger projects.
Thank you. I'll make sure I'll forward that answer to Chineye on her behalf. And the second question is from Simpiwe. He asks, I have one question particularly on the education of architects. The foundation of architectural education is based on Western import, the art movements, history, etc. Thus, our critique is based on that, not taking into account vernacular and cultural approaches and principles to design and construction. I would like to understand the studio's approach to research and implementation. In particular, how do you approach projects in culturally diverse contexts?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And again, I hope that my presentation has been able to speak to that. And for me, that's also why, for me, I think of architectural practice as encompassing making, speaking, and writing, because it's really in the discovery, especially in the making and the writing and the speaking, that we can really challenge this kind of very Western notions of architectural education. And in researching and writing about new ways of thinking, we're able to find new ways to hopefully translate new ideas and bring into architecture, into the architectural canon, histories that have been marginalized or set aside as peripheral or non-important to the kind of to the training of an architect. And for me, it's really about realizing that architectural history did not start with the Greeks. There's a long history that precedes them, and it's really important that we tell the full story of architectural history. And it's an absolute privilege to be able to be an educator and contribute to these discussions and contribute towards shaping new narratives for young people that are interested in practicing and shaping our built environment.
Thank you. The next question is from Stefan. He says, how would you suggest a student architect could implement these ideas in their projects and their ideas?
I would first of all say boldness and a certain inquisitiveness is absolutely needed. You have to, and I started the presentation by talking about my own education and the things that I thought were successful, but also things that I felt were lacking in that. And that was because for me, it was I think that architectural education has come a long way in terms of, especially in my UK-based context, in empowering students to find their own voice, to bring with them their own subjectivities and critique architecture as a way of finding themselves. And that's what we're really interested in our teaching practice with our students at Kingston and also the AA. It's making students comfortable with the idea that their own lived experience, their own subjective understanding of place and the built environment, that their memories of places are equally important tools in how they become designers. And we hope to implement the same thing in our own practice. So we start by thinking about, with projects about, well, what is it to make a space for this person in particular? How might the space really speak to what they need? What is their identity, and how can we find how can we start to address that? How can that space that we're designing for speak to that? You know, I think there's a very fine line. Architecture is, of course, something for others. You are always designing for other people. It's not about you and you only. It's not therapy. It's the practice of making things that other people can also enjoy. And architecture is really for other people. But if you know yourself and what you want to say with confidence, then I believe that you can really design well for other people.
Thank you so much. And the next question is from Olive. Olive, you have the floor.
Thank you, Patricia. Hi, Nana. Thank you so much for your presentation and your work. I am a master's student at the GSA, and I actually moved to South Africa. I'm a Nigerian that moved to South Africa when I was 6. So I find a lot of resonance and appreciation for just how your experience carries through your work. And the question that I have really has a lot to do with speaking and writing architecture. You mentioned Chimamanda as a reference, and I really love her work. And I think what's really successful about, her work is that she deals with a lot of complexities about being an African and the history of it. So her work is also educational in the same way that your architecture is educational. But I think the medium that she does it through is so effective because it's so accessible. And I think my question in terms of speaking about architecture and writing architecture is that sometimes I feel as though architects, we speak in academies. When we talk about our work, I find the way that you speak very accessible, but I find generally that we tend to use big words so that we sound, like we know what we're talking about. But I think my question, and it's based on my experience at the GSA, is that, what are the ways in which we talk about our work and we write about our work, both in like the languaging, but also the medium? Can we broaden the audience? How would your work look if, it was in a children's book? How would it look if it was, part of poetry, as sort of like expanding, how we read the work, who looks at the work? Yeah, that's my question. But thank you so much.
I really love the idea of how would our work look if it was the children's book, and I think that's something to have to test. Actually, I think that's really interesting, and the reason I find that interesting is because I think when in my teaching practice, one of the things I really enjoy about architecture, the reason why I also chose to study architecture, is because I think of architecture as something for everyone, that everyone has an opinion on architecture. We are all shaped by our built environment. We know instinctively what kind of spaces we like and what spaces we don't like. And that's everyone. That's my mother, who has very particular tastes about what the interior of a house should be, or me with my disagreements with that, or yeah, everyone has an opinion about what architecture is. And I think that sense of knowing that should be really championed in architectural education. And for a long time, it's not been. It's been seen as the kind of, it's limited to those who can speak the kind of the language of the academy. And I think that if our profession is going to remain a useful one in the next century, we need to find ways of speaking boldly. And I think that to speak boldly, to speak confidently, is to speak clearly. It's to speak without kind of, it's to speak in the way that there's not kind of try to liken intelligence by confusing people, using very big words and obfuscation. And I think that in my practice of speaking architecture, I'm hoping that what I'm developing is a clear way of communicating what architecture means. And in that, trying to communicate what architecture means, I hope that what comes across is that architecture is really about translation, and it's really about communication and making spaces to develop what the places that we inhabit can be through dialogue. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question. Apologies if it doesn't.
No, I think it does. I agree with a lot of the things that you're saying. So yes, but also, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Olive. The next question is from Dixon. He says, thank you very much, Nana, for the lecture. As a Ghanaian from Kumasi and an Akan speaking person, I really enjoyed it. It's quite interesting to see how you manage practice in these three modes, which really connect seamlessly. I was wondering, did Kente play any role in the installation of Efie of Nana Nyame? If it did, how does it connect to the idea of community and household living?
So Kente, I think thank you very much for the question, Dixon. I think Kente is always in the back of the minds of any Akan person, as I am too. But for us, really, the idea there, and in some ways it's about the idea of weaving narrative and weaving storytelling through a kind of physical manifestation of something, in the case of Kente cloth. But for us in the Efie installation, it was really about weaving the narrative of why we build, and the idea that building is really a spiritual act, and the idea that to build a place and to build a home, especially for the Akan people, started as an idea of a kind of forming a connection to the kind of ancestors and the spirit. So while the house was about shelter, it was also very much about the kind of institution, the practice of kind of finding oneself and that connection back to a kind of a thing bigger than ourselves. So I think Kente did not necessarily play a kind of very direct role in our work, but it's really always about weaving stories. And in that way, we hope that the work that we did as part of that installation was a way of weaving these stories of kind of contemporary building practice through the kind of making of these objects, and that the kind of soundscape and poetry pieces were ways of weaving histories and narratives together to present it in a new way.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two questions. Just waiting on people, I guess. So if you have any question, please, type it in the chat or raise your hand. Yeah. Even if it's comments. Dixon replied, he said, thank you, Nana, for the answer. Really exciting work. Hopefully we get to do some work together in the future with Unit 20 with storytelling and narratives. Well, I suppose. Maybe we can just wait for a few minutes and see if people are still thinking. Okay, I think that's that's it. I think that's the end.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Nana, again for your presentation. Comments,
Thank you very
enjoyable to
much.
see the intersection of your work through the various medium. And yeah, on behalf of the GSA students, thank you so much and have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be able to join the GSA. So yeah, thank you. The pleasure's
Yeah.
been all mine. Thank you.
Awesome. Hopefully you come and get to see the work that
Yes,
we do.
I'm very excited. I'm very
Yeah.
excited for that. Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Mark Raymond says thank you so much as well.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yes, thank you so much, Nana. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
There you go, you're still there.